Hello, my name's Will, and this is Will Photos and Film, where I am focusing on aspects of American regional histories with different lenses. Mountains are coming into sight this morning. We are winding about among large stony hills which finally runs into the mountains, two of which appears in the distance. The one farther to the north is known adjacent as Sierra de Madre, and the other Sierra Grande. The Oregon Trail has been in the pop history conscience for most of American history since it harkened back to the era of westward expansion. It's been associated with the idea of the American frontier, especially since the closing of the frontier in the 1890s, with Frederick Jackson Turner publishing his thesis, Frontier Thesis, about 2 years later at the Chicago World Fair, on how American frontier is integral with the American identity. The video I brought up on the video is from Mr. Beat about his time retracing the Oregon Trail when he drove across the country from his hometown in Lawrence, Kansas to Oregon with the gimmick that he was in a Tesla. This one and the California Gold Rush are often the two biggest trails that most people would often think about from the era of western expansion. There is one, however, that most people would often not think of, which is the Santa Fe Trail, which starts in Independence, Missouri and ends in Santa Fe, New Mexico. You see, if I had a budget like Mr. Beats, I would totally do the same thing that he have done with the Oregon Trail, but I'm not a copy and hack. And two, but the budget's not even shoestring right now.
Am I paying for this? Probably.
I hope so, Pablo.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
The Santa Fe Trail laid the bedrock of the American colonization efforts in the 19th century within the American Southwest, and would later serve as the groundwork of the future railroad and interstates, just like the other two trails. Even to this day, we can clearly see the tracks of the wagon trains that went on this historic trail on Google Maps. The first thing that we need to talk about is the geography of northern New Mexico, where this portion of the state is called where the plains meet the mountains. The trail highlights the rich landscape of southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, where the rolling hills of the plains give in to the mountains of the Sandia Cristo mountain range of the Rocky Mountains. That quote at the start of the video is from the diary from a woman named Susan Shelby Magoffin, who wrote down her experience on the Santa Fe Trail during the middle of the Mexican-American War. So between Fort Bent and Rialto is when she was describing the landscape that would basically become the county of Colfax County right now. This can give us an idea of what these American settlers were thinking while they were making their way across the Great Plains in the first half of the 19th century, with many primary sources describing it as the Great American Desert, which is my favorite description of what the average American thought during this time period. They have entered the expanse often marked on maps as the American Desert, a void on the western edge of the country that was thought to have no practical use other than as a preserve for Indian tribes that have long lived on the prairie, as well as those which, like the Cherokee, has been forcibly relocated from the east. In fact, the Great Plains was not considered fully part of the United States at all, properly speaking, but rather a perpetual wilderness, often designated as the Great Indian Frontier. This passage is from the 2007 book, Blood and Thunder, An Epic of the American West, which explored the conquest of the American Southwest through the actions of the U.S. government towards the inhabitants that lived and still lives in this area for generations. The 4 books that Hampton Slide chose to follow over the course of the book are Kit Carson, Nabarna, Stephen W. Lernan, and later in the book, Henry Hopkins Sid. His own writing informs us how the American public back in the 1840s viewed the Great Plains as this great land being a kind of a desert in their minds, when in reality it is not. We have to remember that many Americans during this time that were coming from the eastern part of the United States, which had loads of readily available wood, farmable land, and water. I have to bring up this reaction from a coworker that I have worked with at Philmont Scout Ranch about 10 years ago, when he told me how Cimarron, New Mexico, in his mind, is basically a desert since he is from Florida. So this is not a surprising reaction for some people who haven't been across the 100th meridian. And if you do come to this part of the country, you should definitely explore many of the side stops along the eastern part of New Mexico, like my friends and I did when we explored the Canadian River Canyon by Mills, New Mexico. The influence how the settlers and later soldiers viewed the Great Plains, since many of the forts were chosen on sites of rivers or springs as rest stops. Water is a very crucial supply when you need it for not just only yourself, but for your oxen. And that would often play into decision making of the settlers, since that is a constant challenge they had to face when they left Missouri. You would probably notice how there were often 2 branches of the trails, which are the Mountain Branch and the Cimarron River Branch. The cutoff between the 2 starts right at modern-day Cimarron, Kansas, and meets together at the cutoff at Fort Union near Washta, New Mexico. The Cimarron River Branch starts at Cimarron Canyon, Kansas, and follows the river all the way down to the Panhandle of New Mexico, heads down to present-day Clayton, New Mexico, and passes over the Canadian River. Fun fact, the National Park Service provides a free map detailing the sites that you can find on the Santa Fe Trail, and it provides a timeline on the other side. Keep in mind, but there are 2 different Cimarron rivers in the United States, just like there are 2 Cimarron villages and cities. But this video isn't about Kansas now. What am I, Mr. Beat? Since we will be focusing on the river and the village of Cimarron in the state of New Mexico, and I have my own history with the village, and I guess the river too, since most of my life has been working at Philmont Scout Ranch. So the history of this village has definitely absorbed into me over time, where I've seen many of the buildings, town layout, and artifacts. And not just the town, but in the surrounding area. I have also done reenactments at Philmont Scout Ranch, where I played a couple historical figures within the area. And I spent a lot of time hiking and exploring around the backcountry of Philmont Scout Ranch. And to show for it, I have a ton of photos to show the landscape, the historical use, and the scouting activities around it. And there's also the fact that I've written about 3 papers for both undergrad and grad school about the Boy Scouts of America and Philmont Scout Ranch. So while my photos don't really mean anything for showing like basically terms of like primary sources, they are super useful to show the effects of human use on the landscape. And for the sake of the video, we're going to focus on the Cimarron Trail crossings once it hit the border of Colorado and New Mexico to Fort Union, which is about south of Cimarron, a good hour drive. Plus, this is a way where I can keep this video project from going crazy in size for my time and my own sanity. A most beautiful morning this has been, fine for animals, cool and pleasant, and we have traveled well, considering it is in Raton. The first part of the trail in New Mexico is the Raton Pass. This photo that I took is from 2013 when I used a Fujifilm disposable camera on my way up to Montana for a summer job. The Raton Pass not only is a historic site for the trail, but it also has a railroad tunnel, you can't see it from the highway, for the Arkansas, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company, which laid the claim for this pass back in the 1870s. This is not the only mountain pass that travelers would have to deal with on the Santa Fe Trail, with the other being Gordiata Pass, which is just outside of Pecos, New Mexico. The trail would pass through a town that wasn't around during the heyday of the Santa Fe Trail until the arrival of the Santa Fe Railway in 1879, which is Raton. This town is still focused on three key industries for the area, which is ranching, heritage tourism, and healthcare. At one point, it was also a mining town after the establishment of the railroad in 1879, where people would mine the coal in the surrounding canyons. And this was not only a stop for the Santa Fe Railway Company, but it also had a Harvey House, where travelers could get some high-quality food from what was considered the first train restaurant. Today, Raton is a classic case of rural flight, since the population is mainly drifting towards the major cities for better opportunities. However, if you're passing through the town, I recommend the Raton History Museum, which is really good at giving like a historical insight of the town and the surrounding area. Before we could move on to the next stop, we need to stop and see the beautiful landscapes surrounding this area, which the next stop will be the village of Cimarron, New Mexico. This was founded in the 1850s as a small ranching/farming village on the mountain branch of the Santa Fe Trail. So the main question is, how did this affect the area of the Cimarron on the mountain trail? Well, using Google Maps and the U.S. Geology Society maps is where we can see the effects of two forms of modern transportation that has changed this village. One thing that can be seen from the map is the U.S. Highway Route 64, which goes from North Carolina to Arizona and would pass through the village of Cimarron. It's basically the main road. And just like I-25, which roughly follows the Santa Fe Trail through the Raton Pass, but this highway roughly follows another trail once central to the American westward expansion, the railroad. This is one of the key defining aspects of the town layout for Newtown, and how it has a grid layout comparable to a modern day town at the time, with its economy being centered around the railroad depot. In fact, the old railroad station is now the town bank, which you can still definitely see the building to this day. The railway companies that has operated in Cimarron were the Cimarron Northwestern and the St. Louis, Rocky Mountain, and Pacific Railway Company, which focus on harvesting the natural resources, mainly logging, found in the North Country of Philmont Scout Ranch. I know that I know. This video is not about the railway's influence on Cimarron, but that is planned for another video. The main focus for Cimarron is to see how the Cimarron Trail has influenced the development and founding of the village, which is now basically the other part of Cimarron, which is Old Town. I think it's funny to mention how it is only a quick drive from the rest of the village on Highway 21, and this layout looks more akin to keeping everyone more centered in case of attacks from indigenous tribes in the area, which means a lot of the ruins and buildings would date back to the 1840s and 50s. Many of the historic sites in Cimarron can still be seen in this area, which my coworkers and I did a quick self-guided tour back in summer of 2019. The village of Cimarron has actively encouraged historical tourism by producing a self-guided tour for Old Town, which you can see a lot of highlights in and around the town. The next stop before the trail would basically go on private property is Rialto, which is on the southern boundaries of Philmont Scout Ranch. So what is Rialto exactly? Well, it is one of the free museums that are open for the public. And this one is one of the only backcountry camps open, too. So this camp represented a period in American history during the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s. However, most of the current buildings at the camp were built in the 1950s by Scouting America. Was the Boy Scouts America, now they changed it. As a way to showcase the history of Kit Carson and Russian Maxwell, when it was originally named as Kit Carson Camp, later changed to include Lucian Maxwell as the Carson Maxwell Camp. The site would become the Rialto Camp. Was at one point the ranching operations for the two men were themselves and their families would try to make a life for themselves on Maxwell's land grant that he came to own after marrying his wife Maria de la Aziz Beaubien. The Rialto Valley was a stunning sweep of land on which to settle, an open country of high meadows and brilliant skies, where the Sandia de Cristo gave way to the endless plains. Elk and deer and the occasional silver-tipped grizzlies roamed this grassy parliament, and trout darted in the cold streams. For those who haven't been there, this camp is really gorgeous with the surrounding landscape, and the current location houses a living history museum with a couple rooms ranging from blacksmithing, a stable, a museum, and a store that is dedicated to the history of the late 1840s/1850s. The only time I have visited this camp was in 2019, where I had a fantastic conversation with one of the program counselors about the history of the camp itself, and how does he approach living history at this camp, knowing it's the 1850s. The Philmont Scout Ranch website talks about how they chose this spot in the Rialto Valley as a way to defend themselves from the constant Native American attacks. We can see this. How this is a defensive choice for a ranch since it has easy access to river, water, and you can easily see down the valley. I can't really put thoughts into the people from the past since we don't know what they were thinking at the time. However, we can see their choices and how they used the natural landscape in the past. And of course, one of my favorite parts of seeing the Santa Fe Trail from Google Maps is the choices where they clearly went around a certain stream, or they want to take a high ground or a certain route. We have finally arrived at the meeting point where the Cimarron River branch and the mountain trail finally converge at the former U.S. Army Fort Union. So, I went there on the same day as Rialto back in 2019 while I was trail hopping my way down to Las Vegas, New Mexico. which is why I have a lot of photos from that day. And this fort was established back in 1851 and operated for about 40 years until the ending of the Plains Indian War. And of course, when the Santa Fe Trail was no longer important for the federal government's interests. One of the coolest parts of this historic site is how you can see how at one point there was 3 different forts over the course of 40 years. The one where you can walk around right now is the 3rd fort, which was built in 1863 and it lasted until 1891. And this was more suited for supporting and supplying troops stationed in the New Mexico territory. The second one is a star fort that was built during the early years of the American Civil War when the Confederate Army was invading southern New Mexico from El Paso, Texas, and the army was ultimately stopped at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. Slide brought this up in his book about how Fort Union and Fort Craig played a major role in how the Union forces fought the invading Confederate Texas forces by turning it into a war of attrition. The first fort was built in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War in 1851 and was made into a small outpost for travelers passing through on their way to Santa Fe. Right now, this fort cannot be accessible by the general public, along with the sandstone quarry, but you can see it from the standpoint of the second fort. After the 2 trail branches merged at Fort Union, this is where the trail would continue on to Las Vegas, Pico, and later Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is going to be the next part that I want to focus on, but I need to plan that out first. I also wanted to talk about the landscape and landmarks and other sites that can be found on this trail and how the history of this area can be reflected in the landscape as a whole. Hey y'all, thank you for sticking to the second video on my channel. The writing's still a bit rough right now. I'm still currently working on it and trying to find my flow. For this video, I wanted to be a bit different from most YouTube history / geography style videos, where I wanted to focus on the sites on the Santa Fe Trail between Raton and Cimarron. I thought Mr. Beast, not Mr. Beast, I thought he did a fantastic job with the Oregon Trail and how he incorporated the museum sites on the trail. And of course, I chose Raton Pass and Fort Union, and there's less museums on that trail. I would love to go back and film at the locations. Maybe do a return back to the Santa Fe style series. However, right now I just want to do a quick overview of New Mexico history and try to get my foot in that door. And also, I thought this was a cool experiment to try out. So I might do a similar approach for the next time with more better writing. And please like and subscribe and comment. That would be really awesome, y'all.